And with that musical surprise, I welcome everyone to panel 2 of our groundbreaking Schiller Institute International Conference entitled Without the Development of All Nations, There Can Be No Lasting Peace on This Planet. The theme of panel 2 is the global majority and the international peace movement fighting for the same goal. I'm your moderator. My name is Stefan Ossenkop of the Schiller Institute in Berlin, Germany. Before I bring up the speakers, I would ask you to send your questions to the following email address, questions@schillerinstitute.com. Questions@schillerinstitute.com. You can also put your questions into the question and answers function of Zoom. If you're on Zoom, you can also put your questions into the chat function of YouTube if you're following us via live stream. Before I introduce our excellent lineup of speakers to the virtual podium, allow me to preface today's proceedings with a few remarks on the topic of this panel. It's around a very recent event involving German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, who had just held a joint press conference with her Chinese counterpart, Foreign Minister Qin Gang, in Beijing, China. She began her statement with a startling admission, namely that the rise of Europe 150 years ago was, and I quote, associated with expansionism, colonialism, and aggression, end of quote, and that, she continued, quote, many listen carefully when China announces its intention to become a world power by 2049 and wonder what path China intends to take in the process. Well, although the latter is merely an assertion by Baerbock, she herself has already made her verdict. Her whole presentation was filled with dishonesty. She then went on to accuse China of all sorts of evil deeds and intentions, deeds it did not commit, intentions China does not harbor. She has done this for the sole purpose of poisoning the minds of the beholders. This is the absurd and dangerous tragedy of our times, that Western leaders such as Baerbock and her master, US Secretary of State Blinken, cannot or will not be allowed to, by their puppeteers in the circles of real power and influence, to think beyond the confines of their colonial mindset. They simply project their own view onto others, saying that they are concerned about human rights and equality and peace, but demanding that everyone else play by their rules, which means continuing total Western domination, the same colonial model she had just described as barbaric. They want to unleash more color revolutions, use harsher sanctions, arm more separatists and extremists, demonize and smear or even eliminate leaders and thinkers associated with any alternative economic and social order. They say they want to overthrow Vladimir Putin and divide Russia. They want to remove Xi Jinping from office and support separatists in Taiwan, Xinjiang, and elsewhere. The tragic Minister Baerbock thinks she can force China to stab in the back Baerbock's sworn enemy, Russia, with whom she has single-handedly declared war. Her entire destiny and personality are the result of this dependence on the neo-colonial script and narrative from which she cannot break free or decouple, as it were, no matter how futile or far-fetched her demands may be. These people cannot tolerate the idea that China's rise is a phenomenon of the emergence of a new paradigm of cooperation and common development. Helga Zeppler-Rusch has often said that we are in an interregnum, a period in which the new global order of dialogue and common development and security among sovereign nations is forming at an accelerating rate, and the old colonial system is disintegrating, also at an accelerating rate. It is a historical shift full of irony, tension, and dissonance, of danger, but also of opportunity. One current leads into a new era, the other into a prolonged dark age and possible extinction. But meanwhile, in the circles and centers where the new era is being formed, the discussion is to emulate China and its successes in eradicating poverty, by mobilizing the whole of society around a goal related to the common and national good. China performed no magic, it simply worked hard. More than 1 million members of China's 90 million plus Communist Party went into remote rural areas for long periods of time to identify the causes of poverty and propose solutions, which were implemented. Most had to do with building infrastructure and installing advanced telecommunications to connect producers with consumers. China has also created an educational miracle. Never in its history have so many schools been built and so many teachers been trained. This is surely what Brazilian President Lula da Silva was referring to when he said, during his recent visit to China, that the Chinese should invest in new assets like bridges, roads, railroads, advanced communication networks. Brazil, like most nations in Latin America and the Caribbean, want to jump on the fast train of development. The Eurasian Economic Union's Commissioner for Macroeconomics, Sergei Glaziev, had just published a study on how the Eurasian Union can apply the Chinese model to its own challenges. And Russia, China, along with other neighboring countries of Afghanistan, such as Iran, Pakistan, and Uzbekistan, have just held the fourth meeting of foreign ministers of Afghanistan's neighboring states and published the so-called Samarkand Declaration. In it, they stressed to combat the drug threat and terrorism, and this is crucial, noting the, quote, fundamental importance of major international energy, transport, communications, infrastructure, and other projects implemented by neighboring countries for the socio-economic development of Afghanistan and its active integration into the world economy. Africa is also fully on board with this new direction. The Arab world is performing a complete reorientation, and China's neighbors such as Laos and Thailand are experiencing an almost unprecedented boost to their existence and prosperity thanks to the Belt and Road Initiative, which secured investments into the rail infrastructure. So why did Baerbock not point to this huge historical shift? She could have done something similar to the French President Macron when he went to China, who brought dozens of industrial and cultural leaders with him. In their Franco-Chinese declaration of April 7th, both sides declared that a nuclear war cannot be won and should not be fought. They will cooperate on 5G, nuclear energy, third-party markets, improving mutual cultural and linguistic exchanges, education, food security, the new Silk Road, financial system reform, and much, much more. So we cannot leave Germany or Europe in the hands of tragic figures such as Baerbock. Other forces who share the perspective of the new paradigm must be encouraged through our organizing and through crucial platforms such as this one to step up as leaders and reshape public opinion and institutional reorientation around the real ideas and demands of the global majority of nations and cultures for peaceful development. And with these remarks, I would like to bring up our first speaker, Diane Sare. She is LaRouche candidate for the United States Senate 2024. She had already successfully achieved a ballot status for the 2022 US Senate race in New York State by collecting well over the required 45,000 signatures. So we are happy to hear your perspective, Diane.
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. I would like to actually begin with a short economics lesson from Lyndon LaRouche.
So the modern nation state was a break from earlier forms of society, which finally brought true justice to the form of society. Now, the ability to bring this justice about depended upon another great discovery which was made during the 15th century, the idea of modern experimental scientific progress, in which the discovery of universal physical principles and their cooperation in their use to the benefit of mankind made possible, with the support of the nation state, the ability to raise the standard of living and life expectancy of the people. And that's what that chart means. that in Europe, in the 15th century, in the great Golden Renaissance, a new form of society, political society was formed. One based on the sovereign nation state, one based on a commitment to fostering and utilizing scientific and technological progress. It is typified, for example, by our dear friend Leonardo da Vinci, for example, who was typical of that, of the science that came out of that. Johannes Kepler is typical of the science that came out of that. Leibniz is in that tradition. The great Gauss is in that tradition. Riemann's in that tradition. This is the great tradition of scientific and technological progress, which enables us to meet the challenge of disease, to meet the challenge of hunger, to meet the challenge of conditions of life, generally. Therefore, these two things together are what make an economy work. The characteristic feature of this, if you look at the chart, is that progress means an increase in not only the number of people you can sustain and the standard of living in which they exist, but an improvement of the demographic characteristics of the population as a whole and of the members of households. It means the means to increase the number of years that a child spends in education and related development. It means the richer development and opportunity for the mind of that child as they develop. And that's what our is based on. Now, what came along here with information theory was based on the work of a fellow called Bertrand Russell, who was probably the most evil man of the 20th century. Russell was the man who invented the policy of developing and using nuclear weapons as a way of destroying sovereign government and establishing world government. That was his life purpose. It was that was the policy we've been living under for a long time. That was the policy of John J. McCloy, who was a boss of Kissinger's at one point, of McGeorge Bundy, who was a boss of Kissinger, and Kissinger himself. That's the policy we're based on. This policy is a complete hoax. It's based on the assumption that merely by transmitting information without any discovery of a physical principle, that you can increase the wealth of society. It's not true. If you base a society on transmitting information without the experience of scientific discovery, without the utilization of scientific discovery, you will have a collapsing condition of life in society. Now,
Great. Imagine being on a flat plain surrounded by hills where little rivulets come flowing in and gather at the lowest point into a pool, a pond of sorts which has no spring and no lower point for the water to leave. After several days of rain, there are weeks with very little rain, but the sun comes out and heats this large, rather shallow puddle. After some time, some green algae begins to grow, and animals drink the water and die nearby, creating a terrible smell with flies buzzing all around. This is what Scott Ritter would call kumbaya. It is a so-called peace movement with no movement, no purpose. All the little streams of water join at the lowest point and sit there and stink. We'll all put aside our differences and be happy that we're holding hands together, wallowing in the stinky, decaying mud. Lyndon LaRouche knew that peace was not static. It is not a fixed state. Now, another image. This time we're in a valley, and many streams come racing from different directions down the sides of mountains or from rainfall or lazy hills, but the valley forms a riverbed, which leads to another valley a little bit lower, and another one, until now this mighty river reaches the ocean. First of all, this river is not going to fill up with dead things. New water is always coming in and creating subtle changes which feed many forms of life. This river can power a turbine to generate enough electricity to power a new city and perhaps half of a nation. Maybe locks and a series of dams can be built, making the river not only a great source of power, but also navigation. This mighty river is what we must become, moving mankind toward a higher state of existence. Luckily for us, we don't have to do the job of destroying the old system. It is collapsing of its own weight, and you will hear much more about that in the morning panel tomorrow. What I would like to discuss is the physical parameters for how we measure whether we are moving in the right direction, as Mr. LaRouche indicated in the short clip that I just showed you. Human development must reflect the laws of the creation of the universe. Contrary to Greta Thunberg, King Charles, and Al Gore, the universe is not winding down. It is not governed by a law of entropy. If one considers the development of the biosphere, life forms have become more and more complex, from plants to animals to mammals to human beings. And this is not a linear progression, but the leaps from one phase to the next occur as if by miracle. Even after an extinction event, like the death of the dinosaurs and 99% of all living species, new species emerged that were more advanced. We don't know how, and you can't find the so-called missing link, as Bertrand Russell and an AI nerd would insist. When we arrive at humankind, we have a new species with two unique qualities: creative reason and free will. While all of us feel the tug of habits and instinct, we can also choose to ignore those lower motives for higher ones. We are conscious that our mortal lives are short in the span of human history, and shorter still in galactic history. But each of us, amazingly, is completely unique and capable of making a discovery of principle which will change the way our species lives for thousands of years into the future. Whoever it was who first used fire changed the course of human existence. And I picked that example, although there are others like the wheel, because another way of considering fire is as energy. Before we had harnessed energy, later in the form of electricity, the amount of energy consumed per capita was very small relative to what it is in a developed industrial economy today. My point is that it is natural for human beings to produce and consume more and more energy per capita from one generation to the next. And that not only is it natural, it is necessary. It is also necessary to have a growing population. There is simply no way to consume and produce more energy without a greater division of labor. Alexander Hamilton already understood this principle very well and elaborates it in his paper on the subject of manufactures. However, as our economy becomes more advanced, it might take more years in schools, good schools, not like what we have today in the United States. The levels of technology will become more complex. There will be less and less physical labor and more thinking required, accompanied by very refined skills. So we will need more engineers and scientists, more specialized farmers, and of course, better musicians and artists to fuel the minds of our generations of geniuses. It may be that some people will need to study until they're close to 30 years old. That means that we need people to live longer and be healthier for a greater part of their lives. The way we measure this is something Lyndon LaRouche called potential relative population density. Crudely put, how many people could be sustained at the highest available standard of living per square kilometer? I think you can imagine why nuclear power would be vastly superior to burning charcoal as a platform for society. You need a society which reveres and is capable of assimilating the breakthrough discoveries of your individual creative geniuses. That's the role of the nation state. A government must protect the creativity of its people. What does that mean? Helga Zepp-LaRouche outlined it in her 10 principles. It exists also in the Declaration of Independence of the United States. I'd like to just review the 10 principles that Helga gave us last December, most of them slightly abbreviated. First, we need perfectly sovereign nation states based on the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and the UN Charter. Second, we have to alleviate poverty in every nation on the planet. Third, the life expectancy of all people living must be prolonged to the fullest potential by creating modern health systems in every nation. Fourth, access to universal education for every child and adult person living. Fifth, the international financial system must be reorganized so that it can provide productive credits to accomplish these aims. A reference point can be the original Bretton Woods system as FDR intended it, but was never implemented fully due to his untimely death, and the 4 laws proposed by Lyndon LaRouche. Sixth, the new economic order must be focused on creating the conditions for modern industries and agriculture and modern infrastructure and transport corridors. Seventh, the new global security architecture must eliminate the concept of geopolitics by ending the division of the world into blocks. The security concerns of every sovereign nation must be taken into account. Nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction must be eliminated, including through the use of higher technologies like Lyndon LaRouche's conception of laser defense against nuclear missiles. The last 3 principles are heavier, so I'm going to read them in full. I presume you're familiar with them, but I think it's worth reconsidering. Eighth, in former times, one civilization at one corner of the world could go under, and the rest of the world would only find out years later due to the length of distance and the time needed for travel. Now, for the first time, because of nuclear weapons, pandemics, the internet, and other global effects, mankind is sitting in one boat. Therefore, a solution to the existential threat to humanity cannot be found with the help of secondary or partial arrangements, but the solution must be found on the level of the higher one, which is more powerful than the many. It requires thinking on the level of the coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites of Nicholas of Cusa. Ninth, in order to overcome the conflicts arising out of quarreling opinions, which is how empires have managed to control the underlings, the economic, social, and political order has to be brought into cohesion with the lawfulness of the physical universe. In European philosophy, this was discussed as being in cohesion with natural law. In Indian philosophy as cosmology, and in other cultures, appropriate notions can be found. Modern sciences like space science, biophysics, or thermonuclear fusion science will increase the knowledge of mankind about this lawfulness continuously. A similar cohesion can be found in the great works of classical art in different cultures. 10th, the basic assumption for the new paradigm, and we've discovered this is the most controversial point, is that man is fundamentally good and capable of infinitely perfecting the creativity of his mind and the beauty of his soul and being the most advanced geological force in the universe. which proves that the lawfulness of the mind and that of the physical universe are in correspondence and cohesion, and that all evil is the result of a lack of development and therefore can be overcome. So, this urgent necessity for growth in energy consumption and population, which is also the naturally occurring process of the universe, is why the environmentalist movement as an anti-growth movement, that is, population and energy consumption must be reduced, is incompatible with world peace. In fact, an anti-growth outlook guarantees perpetual war and the ultimate annihilation of the human species. If you look at what China and Russia are building in the nations they are working with, nuclear power plants, modern ports and railroads, among others, you can see why they have the ability to achieve peace. This used to be the commitment of the United States, expressed very explicitly by John Quincy Adams and later Presidents Lincoln, Grant, Garfield, McKinley, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and John F. Kennedy. It's not a coincidence that 4 of the 7 presidents I just named were assassinated. We in the United States are responsible for restoring that legacy to our republic, and our European friends can locate related trends in their own history going back to Jeanne d'Arc and Leibniz in particular. This is necessary if we wish to rejoin human civilization. But mankind must also build forward to a breakthrough in fusion energy and toward establishing an industrial base on the moon and perhaps a manned colony on Mars. The development of the universe is the ocean toward which our mighty river is flowing. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. If you're new to this conference, this was Diane Sayer, LaRouche candidate for Senate in 2024. You're watching the Schiller Institute International Conference. Without the development of all nations, there can be no lasting peace on the planet. We will have now His Excellency Donald Ramotar. He was formerly president of the nation of Guyana. If you don't know where Guyana is, it's in the north of the Latin American subcontinent. He was the president from 2011 to 2015. We're very honored to have you on the program.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Are you hearing me?
Yes, we can hear you.
First of all, greetings to all the participants. We are living in very dangerous times. Our world is experiencing many conflicts, with the most serious and dangerous being the situation in Europe, the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Let us not forget that the 2 world wars that occurred in the last century both began in Europe. On the other hand, we see the contours of far-reaching changes appearing on the international scene. Alignments are changing, giving hope that a better world, a better and more just world can emerge. As mentioned already, the Ukraine conflict poses great dangers to mankind. This is because 4 countries armed with nuclear weapons are involved in this military operation. The tragedy of this is that it was avoidable if the principle of equal security of nations were upheld and respected in relation to Russia. The fact that it is ongoing and escalating is due to the very nature of imperialism. The desire of the leading imperialist powers for total domination is at the very heart of this crisis. The main struggle in our world today has a lot of similarities with the anti-colonial battles of the last century. The form has changed in many ways, Now we have a collective colonial power in the form of NATO states led by the United States. The main objective is to subjugate the rest of the world to its power. They want to continue the exploitation of the majority of the world's peoples and keep the Asian, African, and Latin American masses poor and powerless. The war was imposed on Russia because imperialism is determined not to have any state that can challenge her militarily. Even though Russia itself is now a capitalist state, its history continues to haunt the collective colonizers. The fear of socialism and communism continues to linger in the minds of the Western ruling class. That is why they have broken all their promises to Russia in regard to her security. That is the main reason for their rejection of Russia's hand of friendship and cooperation that was extended in the 1990s and at the beginning of this century. It is clear too that the most aggressive elements in the NATO alliance have sabotaged every attempt at ending the conflict. Instead, they keep escalating the dangers as they continue to resupply Ukraine with the most modern weapons to keep the war going. The hope is to exhaust Russia. US imperialism wants to ensure that Russia must never again challenge its hegemony. This conflict was also used as an excuse for another plan of aggression against Russian security. I'm speaking here of Finland's joining into NATO alliance. The propaganda line that the West is pursuing is that Putin is getting the opposite of what he bargained for when he mounted a military operation in Ukraine. That is inaccurate. That this was a long-established plan was exposed by the president of Finland himself in his accession speech to NATO. He revealed that NATO was working on Finland for a long time to ditch its neutrality status. He said, and I quote, "As a partner, we have already long participated in NATO's activities." He went on to confirm that the ceremony was just a formality when he said, and I quote, "For years, they have developed our NATO compatibility. We have developed our NATO compatibility," unquote. This is an admission that this was not a sudden decision, but one planned a long time and waiting for the appropriate excuse to execute. To now say that Russia brought this onto itself, even though it never threatened Finland, is a massive lie. This year, this war is not just being fought on the battlefield. The NATO powers had prepared economic sanctions against Russia long before a shot was ever fired. Recall the arrogance displayed by the US when its president announced that Russia was going to face, quote, "the mother of all sanctions," and that the ruble would become rubble. Here, Russia was facing the economic attacks by the US and its NATO allies. Those actions did not turn out as planned. In fact, they have boomeranged, but I'll come back to that in a while. The situation in the Russia-Ukraine conflict has exposed another characteristic of the West. It demonstrated that the United States really pays lip service to global environmental conditions. Its greed and desire for domination is much stronger than its care for the global environment. How else can we explain the destruction of Nord Stream pipelines? This was a sabotage against humanity as a whole. Untold millions of greenhouse gases have been deliberately released into our atmosphere. The talk about caring for our environment coming from the US, UK, Denmark, and others sung particularly hollow at this time. This was an attack on all those who are trying to halt international degradation. Colleagues, without attempting to downplay the great dangers we face, allow me to say that the outline of a more fair and just world could be seen to be emerging. The massive economic sanctions have jerked many countries to appreciate how vulnerable they are, and the fact that such actions could be imposed on any country which attempts to assert its sovereignty. That is why many countries are now seeking membership with the BRICS alliance. This is to protect their own economies. The sanctions against Russia and other countries have forced those nations to seek alternatives to transact international trade and international finance. Already, we are seeing that the yuan, the Chinese currency, growing in importance in world trade. China has proven to be a reliable partner to the developing world. It has earned the trust of great masses in the world. The possibility of a new trading currency coming into existence appear to be very strong. These developments will certainly go a far way in democratizing the international economy. It offers great hope for poor countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. I believe that the attempts at resolving many of the differences in the Middle East are as a result of the growing appreciation by many countries of how vulnerable they are to imperialist machinations. This is a most welcome development. Hopefully, this could help to strengthen democratic forces in Israel and bring closer the day when the Palestinian people can, using the words of Martin Luther King Jr., say, "We are free at last." There is another important task that is ahead of us, which needs the solidarity of our peoples. That is to safeguard international institutions. Since the conflict in Ukraine, we have seen how the West have misused international institutions to their own ends. Poor and not so poor countries have been bullied to vote in a certain way at places like the United Nations and other international fora. This has reached a ridiculous level with the International Criminal Court making charges against the president of Russia. The so-called cause, being the removal of children from a war zone. This is a very dangerous provocation by our international institutions. This is a time when nothing was done to those that invaded Iraq, the murder of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, and the destruction of that land and the atrocities committed in Afghanistan. Yet, no one was charged or even reprimanded by those international bodies. These actions only serve to discredit international institutions. We must urge the international bodies must act and appear to act independently and not subjected to the pressure of the United States and NATO states. Colleagues, the road ahead is full of great promises for a better tomorrow on the one hand, but on the other, it is still very dangerous to all mankind. The democratization of the international economy that is just beginning will not be a smooth process. We must expect that imperialism would not take this lightly. I believe that they will redouble their efforts to undermine progressive governments. They will resort to regime change where they can. They stand ready to subvert countries and to exploit the vulnerabilities of states and resist their diktat, that resists the diktat. Therefore, I want to suggest that our first task is to try to bring an end to the dangerous conflict in Europe. We need peace to solve many of these problems. We need peace to deal with the socioeconomic and environmental issues. In this regard, we have some very important proposals on the table, and we must work to popularize them. These are proposals by the Pope, who has offered the Vatican as a venue of peace negotiations. We have the proposals from the People's Republic of China for peace. Those are very important proposals. The proposal from the President Lula and our own Helga's 10 points proposal. Here she has linked the issues of human development and lasting peace. This needs to be emphasized even more because you cannot have lasting peace without development. All of these are important and have a common features. Let us therefore keep highlighting them and urge that talks begin now. This is the first step to lasting peace in our world. I thank you for your attention.
And we thank you very much for your presentation. You were listening to a presentation by His Excellency, the former President of Guyana, Donald Ramotar. Before I bring up the next speaker, I would like to make a correction. I think I transmitted the wrong email address for your questions. It's questions@schillerinstitute.org. I think I said .com. If you have sent one to the .com address, maybe you can send it again to questions@schillerinstitute.org. We don't want to lose any of your valuable questions. So the next speaker will be Professor Georgi Todoraya, and he's the deputy chairman of the board of the Russian National Committee on BRICS Research, and he is a minister-rank retired Russian diplomat. His presentation is titled "The Expanding Role of the BRICS Plus in Shaping a Better World."
Thank you very much, Chair. And first of all, I would like to express my deep gratitude to Madame Settler-Rouge, Schiller Institute, for inviting me to speak at such a distinguished conference. Of course, it's a challenge to speak on some practical issue after such distinguished presenters, given a very far-sighted vision of what are the tasks and what are the goals of the new world order settlement. However, I would like to speak about more practical things, taking BRICS as an instrument, which I think is can be essential to bring about real practical changes in world order and in global governance. BRICS is a new type of national organization, or it's not yet organization, it's a national alliance. It's not simply the organization of countries, even major countries, and rather call it an organization or an alliance of civilizations. So it is in fact the alliance which brings together the oldest civilizations of the world, which have much more stability and much more long-term dynamics than just nation states. And this is exactly how a new structure of the new power centers of the world could look like. We're speaking about multipolar world. I don't like the word multipolar because polar is, you have north and south. We have different power centers, and they can be different both in size and power. But anyway, the issue is how to harmonize the interests of all of them, not to discriminate against different power centers and different nations, and to bring equality and justice to the world order, which it now lacks. Because a unipolar world, or the world dominated by Western system and Western state, let alone politically and military dominated by NATO, headed by United States, is far from being just. And more of the countries of South and East do understand it. So that's why BRICS may be a platform for working out a new paradigm of the global order and actually new paradigm of societal development. We've been living under the concept of more or less liberal capitalism for last decades. And the communist doctrine, the attempts to build socialism failed. And actually, there's no alternative. There's no alternative for the paradigm of societal development for new civilization, for this new emerging economies and emerging group of countries and actually civilization. So one of the ideas that BRICS may pursue, I think, is to create a sort of platform for working out through cooperation of what I call the wise men or wise women from these countries as well as Western countries to create such a paradigm, sort of collective Karl Marx, if you want, to present some kind of a new ideas and new concept of how society and the international order should function. The second function is the dialogue platform, because there are clear contradictions between the collective West now and other parts of the world. They're especially acute in the case of Russia. In Russian case, the war in Ukraine is, of course, is a sort of a proxy war of Russia against the collective West, which is a very tragic outcome. And this is exactly the result of the lack of dialogue and the inability to solve the existing and growing contradictions in a peaceful, diplomatic and democratic way. Even more bigger conflicts between the collective West and China is also brewing. And if that would come to an open conflict, that would be even greater danger for the global, for the community as a whole. So to avoid it, I think the only way is diplomacy and compromise and some kind of a dialogue. And BRICS can be a platform for such a dialogue to present a collective view of the global development and international order to the West. With the power of these 5 civilizations and other countries and southern nations supporting them, I think the West wouldn't be able to ignore this suggestion, or at least there's a need to try. And here, where the concept of BRICS Plus comes into play. BRICS itself is a very amorphous, loose organization. It has no secretariat, it has no institutionalization, and it's based on consensus, and it's not easy to reach any decisions within the BRICS, being, well, private to this process for already 15 years. I can say that it's always the lowest denominator that we have when arriving to some kind of decision or solution. And it's an open issue, an open secret, of course, that certain countries and forces are trying to undermine BRICS. And of course, big sovereign countries and civilization, by definition, cannot be agreeing on anything in a good natured way, because there are to be contradictions, and these contradictions are being artificially heated up by the West. And one example is the Western efforts to undermine the relations between India and China, which have their problems. But now the West, especially US, is trying to bring in India into its orbit by promoting the concept of Indo-Pacific and trying to create a sort of Asia-based alliance against China and also Russia. And India is trying to be solicited to be a part of this process. This is just one example. Of course, there are many more, and it is essential for the BRICS countries to maintain their unity and to maintain close dialogue. This dialogue is very multifaceted now. We have more than 150 permanent channels of dialogue on different levels, in different spheres, from industry and trade and finance and security to education and technology and medicine, etc., etc. But still, there's a lack of institutionalization, lack of coordination, lack of institutional memory, if you want. So my second idea is that some kind of institutionalization of BRICS is essential for the development of this international phenomena as a viable instrument for changing the international order. And the issue of BRICS Plus is closely connected to this, because if we have just 5 countries, 5 nations, finding it's not so easy to agree on everything, what if BRICS would be expanded? What if new countries would be brought in? That might create chaos. That might create a really unmanageable alliance, which will be married into its contradictions. Therefore, I think that at this present time, rather than expanding the BRICS, it is necessary to create several, I would say, concentric circles, which comprises different relations of the countries of the South and East with BRICS members and the BRICS proper. Professor Bobrov, in the first part of today's meeting, mentioned about Russia's new foreign policy concept and singled out the role of regional organization and regions for the Russian foreign policy. This is exactly what we call integration of integrations, meaning that BRICS is trying to build relations not only with individual countries, but also with regional organizations, such as those of Latin America or Africa, for example, or ASEAN, or other regional organizations. I think that this concentric circle should include, well, BRICS, 5 countries as a nucleus, then a number of countries who are observers of this process that participate in many BRICS projects on a selective basis and enjoy full rights in these projects, but not the full membership. And then there's a broader sphere, broader circle of partners for dialogues or friends of BRICS, which participate only in those projects and areas which are interesting to them, and thus get experience and gain some cooperation with BRICS. By developing this process, in some time we can transform BRICS into a real platform of democratically expressing the views and the interests of the global majority of the countries which now constitute developing world at different stages of development. And what's important, this platform shouldn't necessarily be hostile to the West and hostile to the existing global governance structure, which is dominated by the West. This is exactly a platform for finding some kind of solution, finding some compromise, because of course, we all understand that Western countries' interests, legal interests, should also be respected. They should be taken into account, but legal and understandable interests, not the interests of exploitation or receiving the unearned income for financial speculations. So this is why Russia thinks BRICS is one of the important areas of its foreign policy activity. And we have, especially in financial sphere, and there are strong signals which many countries said, for example, recent appointment of Dilma Rousseff as a president of the new development bank has a strong political symbolism. And it's important to find new financial system which would use international currency based on BRICS national currencies or maybe a collective currency. For Russia, next year, year 24, will be a year of chairman of BRICS. And by that time, we hope that we may suggest some new ideas in the direction that I have explained. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. This was Professor Toloraya. He is the deputy chairman of the board of the Russian National Committee on BRICS Research. Please send us your questions to questions@schillerinstitute.org, because after the presentations we will have extensive exchange and dialogue with the presenters and the speakers. The next one will be Herman Tui Laurel. I hope I pronounced this correctly. And he's a Filipino political commentator and the organizer of the Philippine BRICS Strategic Studies think tank. And he will speak on the LaRouche movement combating the remilitarization of the Philippines.
Greetings to our friends, comrades, colleagues in the LaRouche movement back in the US, of course, and to all the LaRouche movement enthusiasts and supporters and members throughout the world. Thank you, Mike Billington, for inviting me to deliver a short message for the Schiller Institute conference this April 15th to 16th. I have had almost 30 years of association with the LaRouche movement. I was inspired way back in the 1990s when I was a fairly young person. I'm now 71, but since the encounter and engagement with the LaRouche movement in the 1990s, I have constantly been on track with the vision of the LaRouche movement. I recall my visit, greeted and received by the late Gail Billington, and attending the the LaRouche conference in Leesburg, Virginia in 1997, if I'm not mistaken. I just recall very clearly that it was the year Princess Diane died in that accident, which may not have been an accident. On the very day itself, when I was received by Gail Billington and riding alongside her in her car and listening to the radio announcing the death of Princess Diane. It was that long ago. The world, of course, has not completely changed, but it is changing today very dramatically from the very, very unipolar world of that moment in the 1990s, just around 5-6 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, and just a year or two after the PNAC, the Project for a New American Century, was formulated by the neocons and the Straussians in the US. All this I learned from the LaRouche movement. So let's fast forward to today and the march of history towards a multipolar world, towards the Silk Road vision of Lyndon LaRouche and Helga LaRouche coming into reality with China's Belt and Road Initiative and the collaboration of Russia, China, and the BRICS countries for this brave new multipolar world. And we're seeing all the irreversible trends with the BRICS Plus growing, with the peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and possible miracle of peace between Russia and Ukraine if Ukraine is able to assert some independence at some fortunate moment in the coming weeks and months. So we are facing a better world. However, we are also facing a very, very dangerous time for the world and for humanity, for mankind. Unfortunately, here in the Philippines, we have suffered the march of history towards a multipolar world, towards the forever peace world that we are all aspiring for has suffered a reversal with the betrayal of the present president of the Republic of the Philippines, whose name I do not care to mention because I will be saying bad words, because it was a clear betrayal of his father's legacy, President Marcos Sr., to put it more completely, President Edralin Marcos Sr., who successfully cut short the continuation of the U.S. Military bases in the country, shortening the terms in the agreements from 99 years down to 25 years, which lapsed already in 1992, if I'm not mistaken about the exact year. And that was the year that Subic Bay was vacated by the American military forces. The Clark Air Base was vacated by the American forces. And the American forces were happy because it was just a year after the Pinatubo, a year or two after the Pinatubo exploded, erupted, and covered all these American bases with ash that was a problem to clean up. So they were very glad to leave. However, now with the heating up of the global competition of major powers again, and the United States deep state effort to restore its hegemony, these bases are very much desired by these forces, and we thought we were already at the end of it because, again, it was rejected already in 1992, although the restoration of the efforts to come back to the Philippines with these military bases did start again with Obama's pivot to Asia in 2011, promising to move 60% of American military forces to Asia, which of course triggered the intense preparation here in Asia to keep the U.S. bases out, to keep the U.S. forces out, and China's acceleration of its own defense programs. And one of the results was the controversy created over the actually non-issue of the South China Sea territorial claims of different countries, which was designed to create a permanent tension and conflict in the region, which has been successfully resolved by China and the ASEAN countries with dialogue, negotiations, and the code, document DOC. I cannot recall the exact name, but to proceed to the code of conduct, the COC. The declaration of conduct down to the present final discussions on the code of conduct on the South China Sea issue. So everything was happily being resolved until this new administration came in and won on the promise of keeping external forces out of the regional issues, but betraying it just a month after a very successful warm visit to China, to President Xi Jinping at the start of January this year, the first foreign visitor to China, which China accorded the honor to this president. But now we're faced with a struggle in the Philippines, and this new administration is faced with a serious political crisis of its own making with the American war hawks pushing and succeeding in expanding the U.S. military bases presence in the country with 4 additional bases, with 2 of them or 3 of them directly facing the Taiwan island of the People's Republic of China, where tension is deliberately being built up. So there are many things that we're doing. I have to fly to Cagayan province, northernmost tip of the country, where one of the major bases is being built now for the Americans, or with the Americans, or by the Americans. We're organizing people's actions there Of course, there's a range of political colors organizing. We're going through negotiations of unity and cohesion of all these forces. So there are many things we have to do to prevent the next Ukraine war in Asia. And I think we have a lot of support. We have two governors of these provinces in the north that are openly and very vocally against these bases. And we hope we can achieve what Okinawa has achieved in containing these efforts to militarize these provinces. So there's very much to do here. I think I've exhausted the 5 minutes or so that allotted to speakers for this conference of the Schiller Institute. I am working here in the Philippines with the LaRouche movement here, the young and not so young members of the LaRouche movement here. We appreciate their help and their all-out support. Of course, I must mention that the LaRouche movement in the Philippines just lost one of its leading lights, Mr. Butch Valdez, which I'll give tribute to today and remind everybody that we have a load of thanks to express to Butch Valdez and his family for having led the LaRouche movement in the Philippines all these almost 40 years, I would say. So maybe I will have some time to visit Leesburg, Virginia again with the COVID-19 alerts down and renew my ties, personal ties with our friends and our comrades there in the LaRouche movement in the United States and meet your very active people like Harvey Schlanger and so on again. I'll end at this point. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I will be following the conference as close as I can. Thank you very much, and have a good conference.
Thank you very much. This was Germán Tío Laurel, a commentator on the Philippines and organizer for the BRICS Strategic Studies Think Tank, excuse me. So if you're just switching on to this program, you are listening to the Schiller Institute International Conference, April 15th, panel 2, panel 3 and 4 will be tomorrow on Sunday, April 16th. The theme of this current panel is called Global Majority and the International Peace Movement are Fighting for the Same Goal. And we're happy to present you a couple of outstanding leaders of the peace movement. We'll have one very short remark from Tanzania, and afterwards we will have three from the United States, and then one from France. So stay tuned. We will now have a very short greeting from George Mutalemwa of Tanzania, and he is, I think, the director of the Africa Peace and Development Network.
Greetings from the Africa Peace and Development Network. I'm George Mutalemwa in Mwanza, Tanzania. Indeed, without the development of all nations, there can be no lasting peace on the planet. That's why we join you in this effort to change the world for the better through the Global Peace Studies for Sustainable Development in Africa program. Congratulations to the International Schiller Institute on organizing this important conference. We wish you fruitful deliberations. Thank you.
And thank you very much, and greetings back to Tanzania. We will now go to the United States and listen to a presentation by Nick Brana. He is the national chair of the People's Party. Nick, if you're on, please, we're happy to hear you.
Hi, my name is Nick Brana, and I'm the national chair of the People's Party and an organizer with Rage Against the War Machine. It's good to be here among friends and allies, fighting for peace, cooperation, abundance, development, and a new global security architecture. People from around the world who are speaking at the conference. And I'm here today because humanity is facing the greatest series of crises that we have ever faced. The first is the geopolitical crisis, pitting the United States, NATO, and Europe against the East, China, Russia, in Ukraine, in a war in Ukraine that verges on going nuclear. The second is the impending collapse of the global and especially U.S. financial and monetary system. The BRICS countries are building a alternative monetary system and have an alternative development model, which doesn't exploit countries in the way that the U.S. debt-based model does, the U.S. debt-based development model. And that's attracting countries of the global south, the global majority, around the world in creating a new multipolar world. The dollar is likely to collapse and lose its power as the BRICS create an alternative currency. The third crisis is the merging of corporate and state power. This is happening globally, but especially in the United States. This, of course, results in massive poverty, inequality, deprivation, and also more authoritarian governments that increasingly don't represent their people and really hold democracy as an ideal that they don't truly embody. The fourth is exponentially accelerating technological advancement. Powerful advances in automation, fusion energy, ubiquitous computing, driverless transport, virtual reality, quantum computing, blockchain, cryptocurrency, nanotechnology, programmable matter, space exploration, and many other technologies will fundamentally reshape our world and are in the process of doing so on a time scale of months and years, not decades and centuries. Technology is advancing faster exponentially than it ever has, and it will continue to do so and perhaps even accelerate. The fifth is an emerging Brave New World in 1984 dystopia. The corporate state is rapidly building a totalitarian dystopian government and system, society, that could permanently eradicate dissent if we do not fight it and stop it in time. They're weaponizing technologies like mass surveillance, censorship, including online censorship and the manipulation of search engines and social media, corporate media propaganda, central bank digital currencies and expiring currency that they'll facilitate, and the eradication of medical freedom, among other issues. When you combine these, it is the architecture of a mass control totalitarianism, which even includes things such as direct mind control technologies, if technologies like Neuralink and the metaverse are abused, which they will be by corporations and governments that are not motivated by human well-being or peace or collaboration or abundance, but rather by profit and conflict and power and domination over the whole of humanity. And the sixth is skyrocketing existential risk. We face not just the risk of nuclear weapons now, but with exponentially accelerating technology, we face the risk of weapons that are even deadlier and more perilous than nuclear weapons. Genetically engineered superviruses is one. COVID, even elements of the U.S. government like the FBI and the Department of Energy admit that COVID very likely came from a lab and was engineered, in fact, by Fauci, the NIH, with the collaboration of the Department of Defense. Engineered viruses can be created not just by governments, but increasingly by corporations, non-state actors, perhaps even university labs. And we don't have the ability to combat viruses that have that level of destructive potential. COVID had a 1% death rate, and it already destabilized the global economy. It threatened global supply chains, just-in-time delivery. And even at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, they engineered viruses with a 35% death rate that are just as transmissible as COVID. And if something like that got out, you would see the complete breakdown of health systems, energy systems, and food and water systems around the world. You also have artificial intelligence, which is progressing extremely quickly and will be weaponized by those who control it, which is a tiny group of corporations right now, Microsoft, OpenAI, Google DeepMind, perhaps IBM, Baidu, will be weaponized against the people of the world also and used as instruments of profit without safeguards and without regulation, and which could ultimately become completely autonomous and act independently of human wishes, and perhaps even destroy humanity. And I think they likely will unless we introduce safeguards now. We also have the power to redirect asteroids, infrastructure grid hacks. These are leading to a kind of apocalyptic future that only science fiction writers like William Gibson anticipated. And at the same time, we have new opportunities. The global and economic order are breaking down around the world. And this gives us the chance to remake them on the basis of cooperation and shared prosperity as opposed to competition, scarcity, and war. It gives us the chance as humanity to abolish war and empire forever, one of the greatest transitions in human history. To do this, we'll need greater international collaboration as represented by this conference, and we'll need strong international institutions that actually serve the people while maintaining the autonomy of their member nation states. So fundamental changes to the United Nations, if that's going to be the body, and I think that it has the greatest hope of becoming the body that will represent that and help us mitigate existential risks such as nuclear war. To accomplish this, we have great advantages that we've never had before. The left and the right are coming together against the corporate state, as the Rage Against the War Machine rally represented. The internet has given us revolutionary organizing tools, and new political parties are rising around the world, including in France, Germany, Italy, Mexico, Chile, and many other countries. They're replacing establishment parties, especially establishment neoliberal parties that have dominated those countries for decades. People around the world fundamentally want the same things. They fundamentally want good food, clean water, a home, healthcare, education, meaningful work, time with their family and friends, time to live a full life, a meaningful, purposeful life, and the knowledge that they will have a secure retirement and be taken care of in their old age. With the technology that we have now and the resources that we have globally and the willpower that's represented by people such as those who have spoken and are watching at this conference, we have the ability to create a new global development and security architecture that will allow us to abolish war, abolish scarcity, abolish imperialism, navigate those risks of technology, especially the existential risks, while harnessing the benefits of technology. And if we can do that, we can create a world of cooperation, abundance, and peace beyond anything that was imagined, even perhaps just a few short years ago. So thank you for having us. Thank you for having me as the People's Party, myself as the national chair. And we look forward to working with everyone who is here to build on this foundation that we're laying and create that world of peace and abundance.
Thank you very much, Nick. We will go to Angela McArdle. I think she joins us from California, United States. She's the current chair of the National Libertarian Party. Angela, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon or good morning, Schiller Institute. Thank you so much for having me. I just want to reiterate how appreciative I am to start developing and cultivating a relationship with all of you. And I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to start building bridges outside of the Libertarian Party and meeting with people who are like-minded and who care about peace and the future of this world that we inhabit together. I am really dedicated to finding a peaceful future for us. I worked on an incredible project recently with Nick Brana of the People's Party and Diane Sayre, and probably many of you, and Jose Vega, who I'm also grateful for because he continues to work with us on calling out people who do not want peace for our world. And, that was a big anti-war rally. And what I learned through that process is that if we want to achieve peace and we want to work together and we want to find common ground and grow together, we have to really want it. And I was able to work with other people who wanted it. They want peace. We all have a shared passion about this issue. And I think that if we're going to start looking at a framework, right, for how we navigate this world and how we reach a peaceful future, the first thing that we want to do is we want to reach out and identify other people who really want it. And beyond that, we've got to start finding common ground, because I would never have known, that I could develop these great relationships if I hadn't first sought out common ground with people like Nick Brana, and the next step after that is to find each other's humanity. And it is so difficult in this world where we have so many differences and we have corporate media and social media and current trends stacked against us, tribalizing us, incentivizing us to find differences with each other and put those things at the forefront of whatever we're doing. We've got to humanize each other. I think the more we begin to humanize the other side, the more we're going to be able to find common ground. And I think this is how we begin the search for peaceful solutions. I think it's really incredible that the Schiller Institute is interested in opening a dialogue and having a conversation about peaceful solutions, because that's one of the most challenging things, is where to begin, right? Start by looking for things that have already worked. Opposing nuclear war is a really big one. I think that another thing that's overlooked all the time is to avoid destructive forces. We don't want to use those as we try to find common ground. Common ground has to happen organically, right? Like, you can't force anyone to share anything in common with you. And one thing I'm really passionate about is free trade for peace. When goods don't cross borders, troops will. So as you lean into economic research and trying to find out economic ideas and ways to bring about, unity, I want to encourage you all to think about free trade and putting people, individuals, above systems. People are always going to find a way around central planning, because people are creative, people are really wonderful. And I believe in the ingenuity of humanity, and that our ideas are always going to break the mold. Free markets have lifted billions of people out of poverty across the world. And I think a worldwide system of free market enterprise would be really incredible. One of the things that we've seen recently come out of the United States is tariffs. Tariffs always happen in times of war because they are economic warfare. And I want to encourage everyone to consider that as you go forward and you think about economic solutions to the situation that we're in, that when people have economic freedom, they're much happier, they prosper across the world. I know here in the United States, sometimes we tend to conflate economic freedom with corporatism and giant corporations. That's not economic freedom in my mind. When I think about economic freedom, I think about people in developing countries becoming entrepreneurs, lifting their families out of poverty, getting access to clean water, sending their children to school. And those are the sort of things that I believe in. Things that wouldn't be possible, under the auspices of nuclear war and tyrannical one world government. So I hope that you have a lovely convention this weekend, a conference. Thank you so much for involving me. I hope that you continue on your search to find unity, and you meet and continue to meet new and wonderful people. And just remember to always prioritize an individual's sense of freedom and respect and upward mobility, because I think those are some things that once we've achieved that, I know you're interested in economic security. Once we help people achieve economic security, I think that we're going to see a lot of barriers come down, and we're going to see a lot of happy people across the world, and happy people don't declare war on one another. Thanks so much for having me, and have a great conference.
Thank you so much. This was Angela McArdle, the current chair of the National Libertarian Party. I want to bring in another person from the US. Jack Gilroy is an organizer for Pax Christi in New York, but also Pax Christi International, and he's a board member of New York Veterans for Peace.
Hello, my name is Jack Gilroy, and I'm a peace activist in upstate New York, USA. And I've been asked by Diane Sayre, who is a candidate for the United States Senate, a Senate seat now held by Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, a woman whose husband was formerly the owner of British Aeronautical Engineering, BAE, who sold his stock so that she could become an agent pretty much of the merchants of death in the United States, because she has voted every year for more weapons. The obscene budget, which her co-senator, Senator Charles Schumer of New York, who happens to be the leader of the largest international club, so to speak, the United States Senate, Senator Charles Schumer, year in, year out, has voted for the military budget. Now, Diane asked if I would say something about the growing peace movement in the United States. And I'd have to say that I don't believe there is a massive growing number of people in the United States. That is, that the masses are not out into the streets. But what seems to be growing are organizations. Recently in Washington, D.C., March 18th, 2023, there were some thousands of people who did come from around the country to march, and there were 200, representing 200 different peace organizations. Now that's quite, I think there is an increase going on, and that increase, if people will pay attention to what is happening online, this is exemplified in the number of peace and justice magazines and organizations. The Pope himself, of course, did speak to this in 2015 at a joint session of the United States Congress. The Pope said that the arms industry was drenched in blood. And so we'll be issuing and giving the subpoena for the bishop, as the others, to testify on November 10th to 13th at the International Tribunal, the International Tribunal of the Merchants of Death. And that's going to be an interesting time internationally for people to begin to see not only the actual merchants of death, but their enablers. Their enablers, those who refuse to say anything, or those who participate, those who cooperate in one way or the other. And everybody around the country, by the way, has the opportunity in the United States to have demonstrations at the Merchants of Death. There's no shortage. You simply have to go online and you'll find, if not an actual factory within a short distance of where you live, then suppliers to the factory. There are 435 congressional districts in the United States, and we have, of course, 50 states. Every state has military contractors and suppliers. And not only that, but every congressional district, every 435 congressional districts, there are suppliers and contractors. It's so pervasive that that individuals such as Professor Joan Roloff wrote this book that was published just recently. You might want to check it out online. It's called The $1 Trillion Silencer. We already mentioned the $1 trillion that is being spent for the merchants of death, for the whole military system. But you might want to also check out what Professor Roloff says, that it is so pervasive that and so cleverly done by the military and the merchants of death that they are everywhere. They're into the classrooms. Junior ROTC, they're in military, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines are marching into schools, high schools around the country, attempting to volunteer, get people. The military is held up as a sacred cow. They're the individuals who are our heroes. They are saving us from threats abroad. It's a very clever action on the part of the merchants of death. What we really need is something to happen to bring together all of these religious and non-religious organizations that make up the peace movement. The peace movement could multiply if, for example, we took June 10th, 1963, which is coming up in a couple of months. June 10th, 1963 is a focal point. Why June 10th? Because on June 10th, 1963, 60 years ago this year, John F. Kennedy gave what Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University considered to be one of the top academic professors in the United States. What he says he thinks is probably the most important peace speech ever made by any president in the United States. And that was JFK's call to disband this armament business, to do what his predecessor, General Eisenhower, said when he was leaving office, giving over to JFK. Eisenhower said, beware of the military-industrial complex, knowing very well that the military-industrial complex was already in control. But nevertheless, Kennedy said he was going to disband this. In this speech, he said, we are going to disband it. We're going to call for détente. We are going to work with the Russians as we worked during the Cuban Missile Crisis to stop the madness, to stop not just nuclear weapon production, to eliminate them, and also to eventually disarm and talk about negotiations. June 10th, 2023, the 60th anniversary of this speech, would be important. Personally, I believe, after reading the documents, especially of James Douglas in his book, JFK, The Unspeakable, that the documentation is that the merchants of death, with the help of the CIA and the FBI, murdered John Kennedy. There seems to be absolute evidence that this is so. But anyway, that could be the date, and so we suggest that there be a consolidation of people to come together with all religious organizations. The Methodist Federation, for example, the Council of Churches, Pax Christi USA, and Jewish groups, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu groups can join Christians and others to have a moral concept to push ahead. But the greatest morality sometimes seems to be with those of no faith, those individuals who are atheists and others who have a very strong concern for the health and goodness of the human nature. We need to join with those. There has to be a combination, a solidarity, coming together of people of all beliefs to fight the number one issue of the merchants of death. So we really implore all of you to not pay attention to that idea that this is 1939 and it's a Chamberlain issue. Not so. This is 2023. There were no nuclear weapons in 1939. That's not the case now. We have to act. We really can't wait any longer.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for that proposal. We will certainly have an opportunity to discuss it at the Q&A session. We will now bring in our last speaker for the panel, which is Michel Cibot, and he is heading the French chapter of the Mayors for Peace movement. The Mayors for Peace are an international organization with more than 8,000 member cities in 166 countries and regions worldwide. So, Michel Cibot, please go ahead.
Donc, l'Institut Schiller nous propose de réfléchir ensemble.
The Schiller Institute invites us to reflect together on a complex theme. The theme that peace is not possible without the economic and social development of all nations. The objective is clear, but how to get there? The subject is not new, and it is clear that the hoped for development, notably through the objectives of sustainable development brought by the states within the framework of the United Nations, is poorly shared. It is progressing too slowly. There are many paths to explore in order to move forward. For my part, I have invested in the local field. I have devoted 32 years of my professional life to the service of local authorities as Director General of Services. With a group of French cities, I initiated the creation of the French branch of the worldwide network of Mayors for Peace, created and animated by the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and by their respective mayors. This French branch has existed since 1999 under the acronym AFCDRP, Association Française des Communes, Départements et Régions de France, for Peace. I also participated for several years in the work of the French Commission for UNESCO, especially on the peace dossier. Life also led me to visit Japan several times, where I discovered the enormous event of the crushing of two cities and their populations by nuclear weapons in only a couple of minutes. I'm speaking here as a Hiroshima overseas partner, a kind of recognition of the work I can do for both cities. In late November 2019, Pope Francis visited Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The media talked a lot about it. He said why the Vatican signed the nuclear weapon ban treaty. I fully share his call for the banning of nuclear weapons. These weapons, new in human history, have the particularity of contaminating and polluting the earth, thus destroying both the present and the future. This issue of atomic weapons is essential in our days when there's talk of new threats in the periphery of Europe and also in Asia. We also know, since the works of Carl Sagan and Richard Turco, the risk of a nuclear winter caused by a series of nuclear explosions likely to make the Earth unfit for human life. Is this not the ultimate violence of war? I would like to draw your attention to two elements, more specifically, to be developed. First, the contribution of local institutions and initiatives to the development of nations, and second, their international role. I will not give any recipes. I only propose that we open up this dossier and discuss these issues. First, territorial institutions or their equivalents exist everywhere, and everywhere they contribute when their action is not hindered by wars or too much poverty to the good life of human communities, such as the production of drinking water, the installation of sanitation and electricity, construction of schools for children, and the organization of infrastructures intended to feed the populations. These territorial institutions are not always appreciated or even known, yet most of the leaders are competent field workers because from the field. In the year 2000, UNESCO published a manifesto for a culture of peace, containing a series of educational tools to enrich school curricula and promote local programs to build a culture of peace, PLACP, promoted by the French network of mayors for peace. The actors of these institutions know the problems and find solutions. History shows that when war destroys everything underground, men and women take up the challenges of daily life to help, feed, and care for people, even in the absence of institutions. In Hiroshima, I was able to meet one of the rare doctors who survived the nuclear explosion and pollution. Deprived of everything by the general and instantaneous breakdown of close to everything, himself exposed to radioactivity, he devoted all his energy to try to save the wounded, injured, shelter the survivors, reorganize a health system. He survived and continued the rest of his life to take care for the irradiated patients. The network of memorial cities, notably animated in France by the city of Dunkirk, can give us examples of the return to public life thanks to the initiative of citizens after the destruction caused by the war. Second point, international dimension. These possible role of these local institutions. These institutions are also capable of organizing themselves on the scale of the 5 continents. This was the case right after the Second World War with the twinning, the jumelage, and the World Federation of Twin Cities, which became United Cities and UCLG, United Cities and Local Governments. It was at that time a question of multiplying citizen relations through programs of youth meetings, culture, and tourism. The network of Mayors for Peace, from its side, focuses its action specifically on peace and nuclear disarmament through a better knowledge of nuclear damage, educational initiatives, a great work of remembrance devoted to the effects of atomic weapons on humans, including the effects of the threat itself, pre- and post-traumatic issues, the unwellness engendered by this threat that we call today eco-anxiety. Over 8,000 communities in 166 countries are today part of this network with varying degrees of involvement. Depending on the event and the country, their preferred field is undoubtedly humanitarian aid, first aid, the reception of migrants, and so on. In France, the AFCDRP proposes to communities to build local action programs for a culture of peace based on their daily work. For example, an animation around Japanese origami can be a very nice project. A European branch of this network is being created. The recent health, social, and economic crisis have delayed the development of these actions. The closing of the borders is not facilitating the exchanges. Do not hesitate to discuss this issue with your local elected officials and to interest them in these matters. Thank you.
And thank you, Michel Cibot. We have reached now the end of all the presentations and have now time for the question and answer sessions. So I call upon the technical department to bring them up as a panel. While that is happening, I would like to say to all the viewers, why don't you become a member of the Schiller Institute? You can go to schillerinstitute.com and file for membership and become an organizer and be a part of this World Citizens for Peace and Development movement. So are we ready to bring up some of the speakers? Oh yeah, I see Diane Sayre. I see President Ramutar, Jack Gilroy, Nick Branagh. That's it for the time being. So a lot of questions have come in, and from a lot of people representing the Global South, but also people passionate about peace, creating peace instantly. So I think the questions are just fitting for our excellent panel. And I would like to bring up a first question from Diana Svetlana Stoika. She is a doctor from the Doctoral School of Philosophy, Sociology, and Political Science at a university in, I think, in Romania, Timișoara. So she says, thank you for the conference. I have a simple, straight question to whom would like to answer. How should soft power of Global South be used in order to counter the war of Ukraine and work towards global peace? Thank you again. So, okay, we have Diane, and then we'll take it from there. The others can think about the question. Can you be heard? I can't hear you.
There we go. Now you can hear me probably.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, great. This is a really important question, and I think what I haven't heard much discussion about, which is extremely important, is the work that China and Russia are already doing for peace. Now, I know that President Biden and others would not consider them soft powers, but authoritarian powers. However, if you look at the restoration of diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which are two large nations in Southwest Asia, and the fact that that led so quickly to a Saudi delegation going to Yemen, and the potential for ending a very brutal, bloody, murderous 7 or 8 year war in that country. Or you look at the fact that a delegation from Syria has arrived in Saudi Arabia to have talks. I think this is an absolutely enormous shift. And it caught the US State Department completely off guard. And I think it's caught many people off guard. I read an article in a publication, which is normally considered an anti-war publication, which said, forget this with Yemen. The Chinese are just as imperialist as everyone else, and it doesn't mean anything. Well, I think I'm not prepared to argue that all of the agreements that are going to be initially reached will be perfect in their initial form, or that there won't be further skirmishes or other signs of conflict. But I think we cannot rule out the possibility that man is capable of achieving peace. And I think that it is very important for Americans and people in Western Europe, those are nations, the United States in particular, the UK as well, the aggressor nations with NATO under really a certain financial dictatorship or forces that we don't even elect, as Scott Ritter had said earlier, that we consider that we have allies in Africa and in Ibero-America, that we have allies in Asia and nations that we had perhaps not thought of as having much influence. The fact that you have so many leaders in these nations who are now standing up to the military and economic threats of the United States and this Anglo-American worldview should indicate that there is a great potential to change. And I am hopeful that it also would allow Americans to consider that each of us has much more power than we are used to thinking. So absolutely, LaRouche used to use the term weak forces, where something that you might consider as small or less powerful in terms of brute force is actually more powerful in changing the situation. And I think that's what we're seeing. And we have to be open. We can't become so jaded and cynical that when we see a new process emerging, that we presume it's the same as everything else. And to be very clear, I'm not saying this to discount the very grave danger of the threat of thermonuclear war and the other threats that Nick brought up. So it's a peculiar kind of tension, but we absolutely must not negate the potential that a new strategic architecture can come into being.
Anybody else would like to respond to that question about soft power from the global south? Mr. Toloraya, please go ahead.
Yes, I'm sorry, I have to move around now, but I can answer very quickly.
That's okay.
Well, the soft power is severely limited to the developing countries, especially BRICS countries, because it's monopolized by the Western media and Western technology and both technical means of spreading information and psychological technologies and all kind of the media carriers. So I think it's urgent for the big countries like BRICS countries to create some kind of a news agency, joint news agency, an independent one. Well, there are examples of such, established agencies or media sources like Al Jazeera, for example. And you see how much the West detests the Russia Today TV programs, and it's subversive and things like that. So it's really dangerous for them. So there should be some kind of, I think, a special effort which can be financed by the New Development Bank of BRICS to create some media outlets, joint media outlet of BRICS countries and southern countries to present their point of view, to present their both academic research results and political point of view and their assessment to the world. Thank you.
President Ramutar? Yes.
Yeah, I think the only power that most of us in the South got is soft power. Anyhow, but I think, however, that we have to probably act as a conscience because the very fact too is that we are the majority in this world. And although we don't have nuclear weapons, we are involved in what is happening. We are involved in all that is taking place in the world at this point in time. But it's not reflected. The colleague just mentioned the point of view about the media, and that is a very important one. So I think one of the things we have to do is, how do we get the voices of the South to be heard and within our own country, because there are many things happening. We got to first of all fight with our own governments to take stand on many of these issues, to take a stand and to be very clear. If you look at some of the voting at the United Nations that took place, I mentioned it in my speech. Most of it, you could see the third world countries have been bullied to vote in one way in order to try to attack Russia. And to say that Russia was to try to paint Russia as being an aggressor. So I think our first task is to try our best, one, to raise the level of consciousness about our own people. One of the areas is how to get the media more involved, more attentive, because the media behaves in these countries as if it doesn't concern them what is happening in Europe at this point in time, although we all know how dangerous it is, not only for Europe, but for the whole world. So I think that's the first instance on how to organize, how best we can use various forums as much as we possibly can to raise the consciousness of people, and with an eventual objective of trying to get masses on the street so that we could appeal to the conscience of the world to demand that we have a just world, that everybody got a right to security, and I think we have a responsibility to try to put the reality or the true picture of the problem, because many people in these worlds just look at things and take them for granted. I recently had an interview with a journalist from St. Lucia, and they had totally no idea when I gave them a background of what was happening in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, what led up to it. Because I said, nobody's mad to just walk in and attack a country like that. The fact is that diplomacy had failed. That is why it has reached the stage where it has reached. And they had a totally different picture of that. And I hope to try to do more of that within the Caribbean, to bring an awareness and try to use mass public opinion as a kind of a pressure in the developed world to get our voices heard and our concerns heard. Thank you.
Anything else on this issue? Please, Nick Brana.
Yes, building on what everyone has said, I think there's a number of concrete things that can be done by countries in the global majority, the global south, the non-aligned countries, Latin America, Africa, especially other countries that aren't a part of any major power block right now. The first is demanding an end to the war in Ukraine and the abolition of nuclear weapons through all of the available diplomatic means that they have, especially on the United Nations, and beginning to work together as a group in the United Nations to demand an end to the Ukraine war and the abolition of nuclear weapons and other existentially threatening weapons. Supporting existing proposals and mediations, such as that offered by the Pope. That would also be very significant. Having their heads of state, their national legislatures call for that kind of mediation would really advance the dialogue and put international pressure on the United States, the primary aggressor of the war. Also demanding a new multipolar monetary system. And so, as we all know and have discussed, trade is increasingly being less done in dollars, and that's a positive development because dollars been used to monopolize global trade and economies worldwide, especially those of Latin America and Africa, for decades since the end of the Second World War. And so demanding and collaborating in a process to develop a more multipolar set of reserve currencies and trade currencies that serve as the basis for international trade, that will also help. Evicting U.S. foreign military bases is another concrete, I think, way of pressuring the United States and reducing the hegemony of any country. The United States obviously has way more military bases than every other country combined around the world, and has them stationed surrounding countries like Russia, Iran, China, all over the place. Calling for an investigation of the Nord Stream bombing, the greatest action of international terrorism in decades, which has deindustrialized Europe, been the greatest environmental catastrophe in a long time, the biggest methane release. That would also be another concrete step that can be taken, because it speaks directly to the European vassal states and the people who are becoming tired of being subjugated by American hegemony, and it builds on the kind of momentum that is growing in the EU, kind of rallying around France and Macron of all people, towards a position of strategic autonomy from European countries, away and outside of the grip of American hegemony. That's another very concrete another very concrete step that can be taken. And then, as others have mentioned, allow international media in your countries. Ensure that your media is open to a diverse array of providers, not just Western corporate media or American corporate media, but also those from Russia, China, India, those of many other countries. I think those are all some concrete steps that can be taken by countries in Latin America and Africa. And I've been inspired and heartened to see many countries like Brazil and Lula making calls such as that, calls for peace. And if those calls can be made in unison and these actions can be taken in unison, then they'll have a very great effect.
I would jump to the next question unless, Jack Gilroy, do you want to also reply to this?
Well, I guess I would say that, speaking as a person of the North, of the wealthy nations, the West, that there is some really positive features coming out with the newest generation, the Generation Z. Hopefully it's not the last generation, but they, I believe, could, in the same way the Generation Z in the South could join with the Generation Z throughout the world in social media. The question was brought up about expressing and developing a conscience. And an international conscience needs to be expressed. And the best group, I think, that could do that is Generation Z, which studies by even the Wall Street Journal have proven that they're less patriotic, meaning that they're not waving the flag for more bases. As the Filipino man was saying that, we had 750 bases. Now there's 4 more new ones in the Philippines, and they're talking about more in the Far East. We need the young who are saying that they are less patriotic. They don't believe that. They seem to be very open about rate. They're probably the least racist group of people that I have seen in all of my years. They're individuals who have no problem with gender differences. Although everything that seems to be coming about with this Generation Z, for me, is very interesting. Stanford University has been studying it, and the London School of Economics. What can they do to raise the consciousness level, to look toward a unified government, to make the United Nations really an institution that the United States is pretty much forced to become part of? It's located in the United States, but it might as well be in Zanzibar, because the United States has been anti-UN and since its beginning. But that has to be worked on. The United Nations, the General Assembly, the Security Council revamped, or maybe just having a General Assembly, that sort of consciousness making to show the unity of people throughout the whole world, brothers and sisters, the concept of compassion, which seems not to be part of what the United States is about today. So that's what I think I would like to say, is that let's focus on this, not just the millenniums who can help, but Generation Z, because I think there's a gold mine there for peace and justice.
Excellent. So the next question is touching upon the question of de-dollarization. I think this already started as a process with the Chinese-American trade war. I think China has sold a lot of American debt, but of course, with the sanctions against Russian foreign assets, this has accelerated exponentially. And I think if you look at the Moscow exchange, the yuan has already overtaken the dollar. And the next question is now coming from Gabriel Alvarez in Mexico. And he says, the unipolar hegemony is ending with the beginning of de-dollarization. Can you comment on how a new multipolar monetization will lead us to empower the individual without the influence of this new economic power? So who wants to begin?
I guess I can.
But maybe you can answer more generally.
Yeah, first of all, I think this comes as somewhat of a shock to Americans. It really shouldn't, but it is just so ingrained that, and I think many Americans are not even conscious of how much we think it, that we are somehow the leaders of the civilized world. I have to laugh about how uncivilized we are these days. So one, why would people want to leave the dollar? You might want to look at it. Well, we've had a number of bank failures, but also nations that have chosen to park their money in, say, the New York Federal Reserve, like Yemen, or Russia, which had 300 billion US dollars in foreign currency reserves, discover that the Treasury and President of the United States and head of the Federal Reserve can decide at will that we simply want to steal your money. So we didn't like the Taliban coming into power in Afghanistan. So we simply say, the New York Fed and others say, okay, we're not going to give you the money that's in your central bank. We're just going to keep it. And if 14,000 newborn infants die of starvation, as happened in the beginning of 2023, from January through March, well, so be it. We don't care because we don't like you and we're stealing your money. Americans should consider, if there were a bank that were going to arbitrarily take all of your savings, which hint that may be happening, maybe you wouldn't want to keep your money there, and you would look for a way to circumvent this. Also, I think these nations are embarked on a new direction, and they need a currency that's going to allow them to have the kind of cooperation that is needed in terms of energy, raw materials, building transport corridors. You need an agreement for a currency which hopefully will be based on fixed exchange rates, some kind of something to give it a physical value. These are all principles that Lyndon LaRouche outlined decades ago, and I think very workable. So I think this is quite a welcome development. I know the BRICS Development Bank they're talking about having such a new currency perhaps by August, and it is the case, as you mentioned, that the dollar is no longer the major currency of trade among nations at the moment, many nations.
Who wants to be next? Somebody else? Mr. Professor Todoraya is not on anymore. He would have maybe added something to the...
Yes, I'm here. Yes, I'm here.
You are there. Can you add something too? Because I think on the Durban BRIC Summit in this summer, this will be one of the issues.
Actually, the idea of that a single country can be a supplier of the reserve currency is wrong from the start, because it's always a temptation for that country to produce nothing but this paper money, just to print the money and get all the world work for them. That's what actually can happen with any country, which if its national currency becomes a global reserve currency. So any reserve currency, I think, should be multilateral, should be based on a basket of currencies. And this is one of the ideas behind the BRICS, first virtual currency, then maybe collective currency. Some years ago, I have even invented a name for it. It's called Rulind. Rulind is based on the names of the national currencies of the 5 countries. Sounds good, right? So such a ruling can be used first for statistics, and then for credits, and then for trade. And it should be more stable based on the country's population, on their territory, on their GNP, and their technological level, a number of factors. And it could also be broadened to other big economies and countries, and it would be much more stable. and less dependent on the whims of any national government. So I'm not sure how the BRICS will work in this direction, but anyway, this idea had been long discussed in the financial community, and I hope that now with this rupture of international economic relations and international financial order, something should move on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Anybody else wants to respond to this? Then, if not, then I would pose a question to Mr. President Ramotar, from which a question that comes from Fred Haight in Canada. And he says, or he asks, would you care to comment on the positive development in the Caribbean region of nations moving to become republics and break with the British monarchy, and what this promises for the future? This sounds like a 1-hour history lecture, but maybe you can give a concise response to this. Please unmute, or I cannot hear you.
Yes, I agree with the process of the Caribbean moving towards more of a Republican type of status and moving away from the monarchy. I think it's probably, apart from the fact that I think it's outdated, but I think more important is that the Caribbean countries got to build some of their own institutions, because many countries in the Caribbean still have the Privy Council at their last court in England. And I think maybe it's a reflection of many countries still want to hold on to the Privy Council. Maybe they're not yet confident in their own strength, but I believe the Caribbean has the capacity now. They have some very learned people. We have had Nobel Prize winners and so forth. So I think we have the ability, and so that all the countries in the Caribbean should first of all be in the Caribbean Court of Justice. Only a few countries still are in that body, and all the judgments that they have been given so far are outstanding judgments. So that I don't think there's any fear. I don't know why the fear of that. So I think we have to build our own institutions. That is crucial, and it will enhance our confidence in the people. That would have a psychological effect of not making a final break with the crown, and really helping us to gain confidence that we are actually deciding on our own issues in the country. So I support it fully. I hope more countries will go forward with that, and also, as I said, looking at our own institutions. Our CARICOM economy is still not integrated enough. When I was president, in Guyana, we were thinking about a ferry service between the Caribbean countries and Guyana. And I think that will help more and more with the goods trade among ourselves. We still need to do more trade among ourselves and establish a stronger Caribbean market. We have the laws in place, but I still think that much more could be done in that way. So more important, while I see the changing of the status as being important, becoming republics, I also think just as important, if not more important, is creating the Caribbean institutions. Those are the important things.
Thank you very much. Anyone else has another aspect of this? Otherwise, there is a related question from a person. He uses an abbreviation RGZM in Nicaragua, and he has 2 short statements and then 2 questions. I'm just going to pick up one of the questions, but one statement is that he laments that the United Nations does not work at all. The reinvention of the United Nations must happen with the participation of sovereign countries. And he says the new leaders of the multipolar movement should further support the efforts of political sovereignty, economic sovereignty, food sovereignty in all of the countries of the global south with which they have relations. And then he mentions a case of geopolitical meddling by especially the United States Southern Command in Latin American countries where China is building infrastructure. We have seen some reports recently. He says the US Southern and Northern Command in their latest statements have given shocking reports about China's role in Latin America. What do regions of Africa and Latin America mean geopolitically for China? Who wants to pick this up? Maybe Diane, do you have? Oh, there's, okay, Mr. Gilroy.
Well, I just want to comment that I think that when you say geopolitical interest, I truly believe that the Chinese have more interest in economy. I think they're more interested in building their trade. And I think there's a greater sense of compassion that the Chinese have toward people around the world. Kissinger, when he wrote his book about all of his years that he spent back and forth in China in the early years, he was sort of caustic about the fact that China wasn't that interested in military, but what they're interested in is beating the United States economically. And I think they're really beginning to do a pretty good job of that. I flew into a little island in the Caribbean some few years ago, Dominica, tiny little landing strip. Get out of the aircraft and I saw the building of a port just a short distance away. Oddly enough, Republic of China, or the Chinese were building it, the mainland Chinese. That was 10 years, 12 years ago. So I don't know how much further they have gone there, except that they're talking about railroads in South America, as well as, of course, the Silk Road in Asia. They recognize, I don't think the domination that the Americans have with their 750 or 800 military bases around the world, that is pure imperialism in domination. And I really think that what you see with the Chinese is this going to be profitable? And can it possibly help the people in the South? Because they have suffered so much themselves from poverty and pretty much beat it compared to what it was 50 years ago.
Yeah, I would say too that it's a misrepresentation that many people, when they talk about Chinese-American relations, they make it look as if the Chinese want to have a contest with the Americans, and that's the kind of subtle message that comes over in the reporting in the international media, when it is not so. China, to my mind, had a totally different philosophy from the United States and from a lot of the Western European powers too, as far as their relationship with the rest of the world goes. I think, first of all, it has to go back to the old Chinese philosophy that the rising tide must lift all boats, because I think they see it would be much more profitable if they lift the capacity of countries to develop their economies and to be more productive. It is better to do business with those type of economies where people can do business with them. And that is why China's investment is qualitatively different from that of the Western investment. Most of the Western investment in the third world countries goes into the natural resources of those countries. China also goes to the natural resources, but they go to a value added, like for instance, in Ethiopia, in the cattle industry, they're making shoes, they're making leather products, exporting these things. They're making infrastructure, creating the capacity of countries to develop independently and strongly so that they can trade, they can have better trading relationship with these countries. The Western powers, on the other hand, do not, let's take, for instance, Guyana, one in the sugar industry, for instance. Up to now, Britain has been here for 300 years producing sugar. And if the sugar cane, the only reason that they built factory here that we can make raw sugar was because of the characteristic of the sugar cane in the Caribbean. Because when you cut the cane, you have to process it within 48 to 72 hours. Otherwise, they start to lose and it becomes useless. If they could have exported the sugar cane to Britain and to produce the sugar in Britain, we would not even have had a factory here. So, and still we have remained for 300 years a producer of raw raw sugar, where the price is volatile, and the real money in the sugar is in refined sugar and in other type of products, ethanols, other byproducts that you can produce. But that capacity was never developed in the Caribbean. Only now we're trying to develop some of that at this point in time. So and when you look at the Chinese, they will come and invest according to what you want. You discuss with them, they did, and they help you to develop those type of capacities. Also training, a lot of training. The Chinese give far more scholarship, I believe, from my experience, to raise the human capital of developing countries so that they can, independence and sovereignty can have a greater meaning for them, unlike what takes place in the West.
Thank you.
Great. If I,
And ladies first.
Okay, just to add, I really think, and President Ramatar already touched on it, which is the philosophy of China is very different than the current philosophy of this Anglo-American world. Xi Jinping has said, and others repeatedly, win-win cooperation versus winner take all. And people in the West tend to project this winner take all idea, or one of the most evil things that I think was ever done to American school children, perhaps starting with the boomer generation. I'm not sure where it began, was this grading on the curve where everybody in a class can't get an A, that you can only advance by being better than somebody else. So the only way you get ahead is you step on someone else to elevate yourself. And actually the world doesn't work that way. And Americans used to know that, as Henry Carey wrote in The Harmony of Interest. But I also think this is a reason why Gottfried Leibniz, as he studied Chinese civilization, said, these Western missionaries have it all wrong. I think that they actually have a more Christian idea of society than we seem to have in Western Europe. Maybe the missionary work should be going the other direction, or why Benjamin Franklin also studied Confucius. So it's very important to reflect on how we take for granted our own thinking and project it onto others, which is not the standpoint from which they are thinking about it at all.
Okay. Nick Branner, go ahead.
I think I agree that as a first-generation American whose family came from Chile and left during the Pinochet dictatorship that was installed by the CIA in the United States and reigned for 17 years, killed 30,000 and disappeared 30,000 people, and turned Chile into a hyper-capitalist, extremely unequal society, away from a democratic socialist society that it had been, that Allende had begun to create, with much greater equality and justice around the country. When you contrast China's development model in Latin America and in Africa with the U.S. model of Operation Condor, especially in Latin America, systematically overthrowing governments in both Latin America and Africa as a methodology of conquering those countries for Western corporate interests, in Ecuador also, the model extending into the IMF and the World Bank, essentially offering loans that cannot be repaid, or bribing the leaderships of those countries, installing leadership into those countries that get kickbacks for those loans, put the country in massive debt, and then the repayment for those loans obviously comes out of social services and at the expense of the people, and then inevitably results in structural adjustments that put the country's resources at the disposal and ownership of Western corporations. In Ecuador, the country's debt servicing to IMF loans reached half of its entire budget. And you have that kind of financial and monetary enslavement. So there's no question that so far China's development model of building infrastructure in countries and collaborating with them in a way that helps develop developing countries and countries in the global south, global majority, is superior. But I think that we need a word of caution there too. And they have a different history. China has a different history, obviously, than the United States. It's not an imperial history. But a word of caution is that the countries of the global majority, the global south, non-aligned countries, smaller countries that aren't the big kind of original BRICS players or the big European powers, they still, in this moment where we're recreating a global security, economic, monetary architecture, this is a moment where those countries do need to assert their power and do need to work together, even to influence China and the original BRICS countries, and perhaps BRICS Plus is a forum, and I think the UN is also, to ensure that we don't recreate a system or create a system that has the potential to slide into the kind of financial monetary hegemony that we see. And so that there be an international currency that is an international global reserve currency that isn't monopolized by any one country, be it that China take the place of the United States in doing that. And so now is the time, when that new system is being created and emerging, and you have the decline of American hegemony and the dollar, is the time for the global South to assert itself in doing that. And the last thing I want to say is that I think that the United Nations is the most valuable international body that we have in order to do that. First and foremost, because the model is one nation, one vote. That has a structural preference built in for those countries that have less power and less wealth and are less developed to begin with. And that is a very strong premise to start from if you're trying to achieve global abundance and eradicate things like poverty. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, remains as true and as relevant today of an aspirational document as anything that has been produced by the world. It's truly a beautiful manifesto. That said, of course, the UN, as others have said, needs to be rehabilitated. The Security Council needs to be completely remade. Permanent membership needs to be eliminated. And there needs to be greater an ability to maintain sovereignty while at the same time having greater authority and serving in the interests of the people of the world and its member nations.
Diane, go ahead and unmute yourself. We cannot.
Yeah, sorry. The questioner,
Right.
I just turn them if they missed the first panel, because there was that Chinese speaker who I think gave a very clear description of how China is thinking about developing these markets, and that will answer that question. And I'd like to add one more thing in response to Nick, if I may, because this question of the UN Security Council ought to make us reflect on something. Why was it that it was the US, Russia, China, France, and the UK? Well, because there had been a certain collaboration among these governments in defeating fascism. That's why Japan wasn't on the Security Council, or Germany. And somehow today, if you look at the alliance of forces or the situation between Ukraine and Russia, the fact that we have an explicit revival of outright Nazism is not even allowed to be discussed or mentioned. But there was a time when most of the world actually believed in never again. That's it.
And the assertion of more self-confidence by the Africans became a very prominent issue recently with a video that went viral with the former president of the German parliament, and he is now also the CEO of the most important political foundation. And he was in Namibia, which was a German colony, and he sort of criticized that the Chinese population is growing in Namibia, and the president of Namibia immediately stopped him and said, look, might be a problem from your point of view. It's not a problem from our point of view. And Namibians in China are treated very preferably and very badly in Germany. So this shut him up completely. And just 2 weeks ago, there was an article saying that it doesn't need a Putin, that people in the so-called global South are skeptical of Western interests. The only reason for this is the West itself. I'm just trying to translate as I go along, and it says that basically that European governments, including also the USA, have left scorched earth, etc., and very bad things have happened during the past 500 years of colonialism. So it's no wonder that outside of the West, people are raising their eyebrows when when Europeans are claiming that they are now on the right side of history. I just wanted to bring this up because it's very indicative of this new self-awareness and confidence of Africans and the global Southern leaders. But the next question is, of course, is by a guy called Manuel in Spain, and it's about organizing the forces internationally. He first of all, he says, for us as a global majority to achieve peace, we must first unite to set limits and control political power in each nation. What movements and associations exist in other countries with clearly defined goals to return power to the people? And in what way can we connect to advance as humanity in this horizon? I think that's a good question for all of you. Who wants to be number one? Jack Gilroy, please go ahead.
Well, I'm just saying that it's a very good question because organizing, I think, is prime. And Diane spoke down in Washington D.C. on March 18th, and it was an anti-war rally. And I'm sure some of the rest of you were there. Maybe Nick was there, but in organizing. But there were only several thousand people, to my understanding, there. But there were over 200 organizations that signed on. And I think that it was Nick that mentioned a little bit earlier that there is a growth in magazines, in online groups, and organizing groups for peace and justice rather than in comparison to previous years. So where does that go? And I hate to repeat myself here, but I think that we're missing the opportunity with millenniums, but especially with Gen Z people. The Gen Z young people, I think, are ripe for organizing, not just for the environmental work that Greta Thunberg and so many other young people did with the environment, where adults eventually jumped on the bandwagon. They begin to follow a kid, a 15-year-old, 14-year-old child. There's something there that I think that if we, again, focus on Gen Z people, then there is a possibility that organizations that will, for the first time in a long while, be more concerned about compassion around the world rather than their own little clubbish kind of national attitude. So an international gathering, if you could only get Greta to be one of the leaders, but if not Greta, other young people who followed through, I think that there's a great opportunity to bring about unification and better, at least a greater concern for the betterment of the nations in the South. That's about all
Thank you. Anyone else wants to respond? Nick is
I'll say
already
a couple things,
nodding.
and I think it has some, I
Okay, go
mean,
ahead,
being
Diane.
one of the co-conveners of the Rage Against the War Machine rally has a sense of this. But look, the Schiller Institute is the place to come for this, and the Schiller Institute is building a youth movement internationally. And because of the pandemic isolation and lockdowns, a lot of us became much more facile with using Zoom and finding that we could have meaningful conversations with people far away in other parts of the planet. Now, of course, that does depend on having electricity and internet service in some places. But I would really urge you to sign up and become a member of the Schiller Institute, and indicate if you're a young person, if you want to be involved in this movement. There's been a series of youth meetings with Helga Zeppler-Rouche directly, and it's very important. I also wanted to echo something actually that Jack Gilroy had brought up, which is I very much like this idea of June 10th being a kind of day of action, even an international day of action, the 60th anniversary of the Kennedy speech, in which he elaborated exactly this kind of um, international collaboration as an alternative to mutual annihilation. I think that's a very good idea for future action. And we're seeing now this process, which Jose Vega has become famous or infamous for, of intervening at various events, town hall meetings of your congressmen, meetings of gaggles of journalists, as Jose and I and others did recently, and then putting it out on social media. And what we're finding is that people are now replicating this not only in the United States, but internationally. And that is very powerful in terms of unifying the resistance. But please, everybody, join the Schiller Institute and become active with us.
Nick, it's your turn.
Yeah, and I want to say Diane is absolutely correct. The Schiller Institute is consistently one of the only organizations that is putting together gatherings with people from around the world, like the people at this conference. Such an impressive list of dignitaries, social movement leaders, political leaders, and that's exactly what we need to encourage. We shouldn't wait essentially for this dialogue to happen on the governmental level, but rather it should be happening. The people of and civic leaders should be talking to each other on their own in this fashion, because that's how we'll be able to assert the pressure to create a new global security and development architecture that is actually going to represent the interest of people worldwide and be able to fulfill our technological and resource potential for abundance and peace globally. I think that also, of course, as the Rage Against the War Machine protest, we were able to bring together thousands of people from across left and right to the Lincoln Memorial in the White House on February 19th. And it represented, I think, an emerging zeitgeist that I talked about in my portion. That is that at the same time that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party become increasingly indistinguishable. It becomes increasingly clear here in the United States that they're part of one duopoly, a uniparty that represents just naked corporate billionaire interests, not the interests of the people in this country, and imposes it because of its position in the world, imposes it globally. There is a coming together of people across the ideological spectrum that is happening in the U.S. And those barriers and labels that have long been used for decades, weaponized by the television, by corporate television propaganda to isolate communities here in the U.S. politically by left and right, or liberal and conservative, and all of these different terms As Jimmy Dore says, teaching us to hate our neighbor as opposed to loving our neighbor and seeing them as a fellow human being with fundamentally the same interests, the same needs for good food, water, healthcare, housing, the desire to give their kids a platform for greater success than they've been able to achieve in their life, and find meaningful and purposeful work and things to commit themselves to in their life. That's breaking down, and that's a very positive, strong step, and it creates the possibility and increases the possibility that there can be a united populist kind of opposition to the establishment and this kind of high-tech dystopian control system and hegemony, and this military hegemony that has existed. And we're working to connect with others who are leading similar movements against, for example, NATO in European countries. And so, and looking to produce a movement, an international movement within NATO of anti-NATO and anti-war movements in those countries. And if we can bring those together and perhaps act as one, perhaps we can push countries to begin to leave NATO and abolish NATO ultimately. So I think that's fertile ground for collaboration, opposing the war machine globally and ensuring that we produce a global security and development architecture that truly represents the interests of the people and is protected from becoming monopolized by any one nation or small group within those nations of wealthy people. Those provide fertile ground and room for collaboration across national and international bounds.
Absolutely. The dissolution of NATO is long overdue. So do we have anyone else respond to this question?
I would like to have one more thing to say. I mentioned earlier in remarks about the Merchants of Death Tribunal, which will be November 10th to the 13th. And what Nick was just saying about the war machine and breaking down the war machine, obviously it's not going to happen until we get after the merchants of death themselves. We have this tribunal that will be coming up, will be focusing on just 4 of the major merchants of death. There are over 100 in the United States, but of course, Lockheed has 400 industries throughout the world, right? Lockheed Martin. We will have those individuals subpoenaed. They won't show, but we have people like Cornel West and others who will be speaking. I hope that Diane will be able to speak, for example, about some of the groups such as Raytheon, that is the huge missile producer with gigantic. In fact, I think even today there are people, small groups down in Arizona protesting Raytheon, the #1 missile contractor in the whole world. And then, of course, Boeing, which does very well commercially, but very, very well militarily. And we have also selected another one, not one of the top ones, but because they are into the new AI business of automative drone intelligence. In other words, it's General Atomics making the MQ-9 drone, which are now being sent to Poland, right? Just imagine that if they are used against the Russians. So the drone industry, the new war of drone warfare, is something that we're focusing on in using the General Atomics as a focal point. So if you want to learn a bit more about it, go to merchantsofdeath.org, merchantsofdeath.org, and get in. Every place in the country, every congressional district in every state has, of course, either enablers, individuals who will speak up and support these industries, or they have factories or supply lines. And so there's no shortage. Just go on Google and you'll find one in your area. You can be sure. And to try to get people out in the street in protest. There is great fear in the United States. And that, of course, is the silencer that Joan Roloff spoke about in her book, The $1 Trillion Silencer. they're so philanthropic, they're just so awash in money, the merchants of death, that they get Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, they get the NAACP, they get women's groups, men's groups. All they pour money into these groups, and therefore the people are beholden to the Pentagon and its contractors. So I think one great opportunity is to expose this to the people, to try to reduce their fear and expose those who actually pretty much control the American economy, the Pentagon and the war contractors. 54% of the discretionary budget in the United States goes to war materials.
So I would like to bring up one or two more questions and then ask for final conclusive remarks before we close this panel. But the next question is for Diane specifically, and it's from Omar Smith, and it's on the economic theories that you have expounded on. Could you expound further on the advancement of labor and productive methods you mentioned? And he quotes you, less time physical labor and more time mental labor. What does that mean for physical labor? And does that mean working smarter, not harder?
Well, I guess you could partly say that. I mean, look, we have a myth that's perpetrated that the United States became a great nation on the back of slave labor. Well, that's physically impossible because there is a limit to what the human body is capable of doing. I don't think well, maybe they could lift a few tens of pounds more because of medical advances, but a weightlifter today is so much more powerful than someone working on a plantation. And the British knew that, which is why they wanted to keep the US as a slave nation, why they backed the Confederacy and wanted to keep us beholden to that physical limitation. And in fact, Frederick Douglass writes about this very thoughtfully in his autobiography, because he said in the South, everyone said, well, don't go up there to the North. They don't have slaves, and they have a much more primitive and difficult life because they don't have people to go draw the water and this and that. Well, then he gets to the North and discovers that, in fact, in the North, people have indoor plumbing. They actually have a higher standard of living than the people depending on human slave labor. So as an economy advances, you still need people to be productive, but you can take, for example, agriculture as an example, where one person farming could only farm a certain area of land. If they added an ox, maybe a little bit more. When they got to a modern tractor, a bit more. When they got to what our friend Bob Baker calls the space farmer, where you have satellites, which are measuring the chemical components of your soil, and you know directly exactly how much fertilizer to apply where, and you're using mechanized technology, you still obviously need the farmer, but one farmer is capable of doing what perhaps several hundred people could do earlier. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to put everyone out of work, because the question is, who is going to develop these advanced tractors? Who is going to discover the satellite technology, the kinds of spectroscopy that are used to analyze the soil from a distance? So what it means is you're going to have more people with higher levels of education and skill. You see the same thing in medicine now, and it's kind of a mess because we have a very flawed way of thinking on the one hand, where people just you throw drugs at specific symptoms. But on the other hand, you do have certain incredible advances in cancer research and other ways where people have really honed in on a particular type of cancer and become a specialist or an expert in that area. Well, that means they're an expert in that area, but they probably are not an expert in how to repair a broken bone or something else. So again, what happens is you need a greater division of labor. You need more people in your workforce in order to maintain a higher platform of your physical economy. And the more that occurs, the less and less you want to rely on physical labor. I think there's no replacement for the human element in observing certain things. There are problems that will come up that a machine or a robot is not going to solve, which require the element of human imagination, and that is irreplaceable. But in terms of the brute work, the physical work, we'd like to use our bodies as little as possible for that kind of thing and develop our minds and our creative capabilities.
President Ramatar, do you have any thoughts on the labor and productive question?
Yes, I do. I think the productivity of labor nowadays is far, far higher than it was before, and that has to do with the development of science and technology in our world. But it has created other issues for us, because I think one of the problems in the past, the worker was just considered a person who worked with his hands physically and so forth. And now you have people working with their brains. A lot of people working with their brains and becoming much more productive and so forth. But if you look at some of the media describing the new worker, for want of a better word, they describe them not as workers, but as middle class. So one of the problems I think we have to overcome in this modern times that we have, because I still strongly believe that the workers are the most potent force to bring about change. But the problem that I think we're facing today is that the workers' consciousness is really lagging his position within production itself now. Many of the workers see themselves as intellectuals and not as workers themselves. Because if you look at the years gone by, the proletarianization used to take place from the destruction of the more advanced technology in the agriculture. And then you had surplus labor in agriculture, which went over to the working class. But now if you take, let's say, the UK or the United States, 1 to 5% of the people are feeding the whole nation because of the development of technology. You can't continue doing the proletarianization in that regard. So where are the new workers coming from now? I think they're coming from the intellectual class that are being now involved directly into the society. But the difficulty in organizing them, and that is probably part of the difficulty in the trade union movement too, that they don't see themselves as workers in the first instance. They see themselves as probably above the worker. So I think we have a lot of work to do to let them see that they too are exploited. They might be working for far more money than the man who worked in the garbage truck, but their mentality is they must recognize where their position, what position they hold within the whole system of production, and to see that they're probably more exploited, probably far more exploited than the worker who works with his hand alone. That's my contribution.
Thank you very much. I only know that President Lula da Silva, I think, has been touring the Huawei headquarters in China, and they're already discussing 6G for Brazil. As far as I know, we in Germany don't even have 4G nationwide. We're struggling with the coverage because, you cannot leave everything to the market. I think I agree with Professor Yi on this point that infrastructure is a public good. So you cannot have all these profit-oriented private companies competing over the market, and that means that you have the cities are well covered, but the rural areas are not covered. So there are all these things that have to be considered. But given the time, I think we should wrap it up. Everyone, I think, has 1 or 2 minutes to give some remarks to conclude this panel. I just want to maybe bring up what we have in store tomorrow. People should absolutely not miss panel 3 and 4 tomorrow. If you have any questions relating to the collapse of the financial system, then panel 3 is where you should definitely go to. It starts at 9 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time and 3 p.m. Central European Time. It's called The End of the Casino Economy Before It's Too Late. Very excellent speakers. And then we have panel 4, The Necessary Philosophical Foundations for the New Paradigm, also with excellent speakers. So that's what's coming up tomorrow. And now I'm going to give the floor. I'm sorry, the concert with Handel's Messiah, I believe. Is that true? Yeah. Okay, great. No, I just didn't think of it. Thank you. And so I just want to, maybe in order of how I see you, Diane, Nick, President Ramotar, and Jack Gilroy, in that order, 1 or 2 minutes to wrap up. Give your concluding remarks. Oh, I'm sorry, and Miss Professor Toleraya, you can be the number 5.
Well, I would just like to say that what we're discussing, and particularly the issues that Nick raised, going back to that, underscores General Douglas MacArthur's comments on the deck of the Missouri when he received the surrender of Japan, that there has to be a spiritual recrudescence if we're going to avoid Armageddon. That is, that we have these very advanced scientific capability, but it seems that man morally, he didn't use that word, but morally has not grown up enough to make good use of the discoveries he is making. And I think there is a reason why Helga Zepp-LaRouche named this institution after Friedrich Schiller, who wrote a series of letters on the aesthetical education of man after he was so bitterly disappointed by the French Revolution and the failure of the people of France to rise to the level of creating a republic as had happened with the United States, but fell into various pitfalls and got buffeted about because their identities were so small that it was easy to organize them into lynch mobs against the intellectuals. And we see this very much going on in the United States. Angela referenced tribalism, where people are pitted against each other, and you have very strong emotions about why you should hate this person over a quite minor issue, which has nothing to do with whether mankind lives or dies. And so Schiller wrote these letters because it was clear to him that you had to actually educate the emotional capability of the population to be a great people in a moment of crisis and a moment of opportunity. That is why the question of classical culture is so important. That is why it is so important to understand that mankind is not an animal, as Lyndon LaRouche used to say, that our species is unique, that every single human being has an innate potential for genius, and that we owe it to ourselves, past generations and future generations, to create a society where that spark of creative reason can be nourished and developed, which leads to the happiness of the individual and the happiness of society. So I just think it's very, very clear we need a cultural, spiritual, moral renaissance if we're going to be able to effectively wield the new scientific breakthroughs that are coming into our hands as capabilities.
Nick Branner, next.
I think that's beautifully said, Diane, and I agree with everything you said. And I want to say that from the perspective of the People's Party, we think that the accelerating pace of technology has really called the question globally on whether humanity is going to survive at all, or whether we are going to progress into a kind of technological dystopia of technologies that allow even a level of control over people that has only been dreamed of by dictators in the past, and direct interfacing with people's minds, that kind of thing, the abuse of technologies like Neuralink. So on the one hand, technology could, if we don't win that kind of wisdom race to catch up with our incredible technological potential, on the one hand, we could annihilate ourselves through nuclear war, artificial intelligence that goes out of control, or super engineered viruses, or many other technologies, nanotechnology, others that are emerging, or end up in a permanent totalitarian surveillance dystopia. We already live in kind of a combination of 1984 and Brave New World. But the other side of that is that those same technologies, if managed intelligently, if we have the right global institutions and infrastructure to distribute the wealth that it produces, and the strong democratic systems that enable us to overpower and overcome the influence of concentrated wealth and corporate power that now dominates the world, in combination with state power, then we can really create a world that is equally beyond, or has been beyond our imagination, one of global abundance, meeting everybody's needs worldwide, the ability to go out into the stars, to colonize other worlds, and to do so as a unified human family, the ability to creatively explore and develop everybody's creative potential for genius, and to progress art, literature, science to levels that they never have before. And this is the ultimate question of our time. It's paradise or oblivion, as Jacques Fresco, the great systems theorist, once put it. So it's those of us who come together here in conferences like this and these dialogues, which can help us realize that great potential that we have to navigate it towards the benefits.
Excellent, thank you. President Ramotar, please.
Just to say that that the most important issue that we have facing us now is the question of peace, and that raises the issue that we have to challenge. I don't think we're challenging the theory that nuclear weapons have kept the peace for so many years. I think that that's a dangerous theory, and now we're seeing how close it is bringing us to where we can liquidate ourselves in a way. So I believe one of the first things we have to do is to revive in a very, very strong way the fight to total nuclear disarmament in the first, and total disarmament as an objective finally, but the immediate task is to have nuclear disarmament. I think that's very, very important, because we have already reached a stage in the world where mankind has enough. We're producing enough to feed everyone. What is wrong is the system that governs the world, where you have production of plenty, and it's not only producing tremendous wealth, but continuing to perpetuate poverty. So, but for us to fight to change that, we have to also ensure that we preserve peace. And the struggle, therefore, for peace and the struggle for social progress, which goes back to Helga's proposal, I think it's very important that we fight for these things simultaneously, but at this point in time with an emphasis for peace. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take Jack Gilroy and then Professor Toleraya.
Yes, what was just mentioned about the feeding the world. David Swanson, who runs the international peace organization called World Beyond War, completed studies some years ago that just taking 3% of the United States military budget each year would end world hunger. I think what needs to be done is to have teachers from the earliest grades really focus on love and compassion. I think that, and even the word peace is not, I was a high school teacher, and you couldn't use the word peace studies, because that was considered to be controversial. But I think teachers have to go beyond that and to begin to really focus on the idea of teaching love and compassion. I was not taught that. I was taught to hate the Japanese, to hate the Germans, to hate the Russians. And then it was the Chinese, and then it was the Koreans, but not South, North. And then it was the Vietnamese, but North, and on and on. You know the story. We are taught the hate, as the South Pacific musical used to blurb years ago. That has to change. I don't think there is going to be a reduction in the military and in the merchants of death, et cetera, unless this evolutionary change that young people seem to be going under can really sweep the world. It may take more than a decade or a generation, but I think it's on its way. And I'd say that happily, that I think we're on the right path. And I really love being with you people, because I think of that particular mode in thinking. So thank you for letting me say my thing. I'm probably the oldest by far.
We're happy to have you on too. So last but not least, Professor Toloraya, are you there? There you are.
Well, yes. Well, I would like. Yes. I would like to thank the organizers of the conference for giving a possibility to speak, although we do not necessarily agree on every point. For example, speaking of me, I don't really believe that the abolition of nuclear arms would bring peace forever. I think it would unleash another even greater wars when there will be no limitations. So, but that's my view, and I think we should have more possibility to express them and to exchange these views. And it's a very good thing that organizes these conferences. One thing I would suggest that more of the BRICS Plus countries' representatives should be brought into this discussion, because in the West there's a sort of lack of understanding and total ignorance of for example, of international relations theories which are circulating in the South and developing world. There's ignorance of their history, of their civilization, and there's no possibility for them to speak and to express their ideas and to exchange views. And I think that it should be important for the BRICS Plus countries to have this speaking venue such as Schiller Institute. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. And we should use the proceedings of this panel and the other panels to organize people to come aboard, to become part of this world citizen movement. I want to thank everyone from the bottom of my heart for your great ideas, your willingness to have this frank and open dialogue about the theme of a global majority and the international peace movement fighting for the same goal. So, as I was saying, please come back tomorrow for panel 3 and 4 and the concert, of course. Handel's Messiah, Let Us Have Peace, Handel Messiah, Schiller Institute, New York City Chorus, online and live at the Church of St. Paul's and St. Andrews in New York City. This will be a wonderful event. If you still have questions that haven't been picked up, please send them, questions@schillerinstitute.org. We will pick them up at a later event or send them to the speaker and presenter. Please get in touch with us. Become active. Go to our website. If you think these ideas speak to you, then become a member, become an organizer, becomes, as Helga would say, a multiplicator, somebody who is multiplying these ideas. And if you want to read more about LaRouche's theories, you can either go to larouchepub.com and have a subscription of the Executive Intelligence Review magazine. You can also somehow, I think, write us an email and order volume 1. I think there's also volume 2 of Lyndon LaRouche's collected works. This was a great piece for personal development. So anyway, this is what I want to say, and I want to thank you once again. This concludes our panel for today. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye-bye.